Rocky Snyder. In the house with me, Jack Snyder. Jack, how are we doing today?
Doing pretty well. Trying to stay warm and dry.
Looks like we got our guest calling in, huh? All right. Well, then, I guess we'll just start with Talk of the Bay. In case you're wondering, you're listening to KSQD, Santa Cruz, KSQD. And with me is going to be our first guest. We're talking actually with... Talk of the Bay for us, for Jack and myself, we're trying to find people in our community that are doing some amazing things in the world. And there we are not in a shortage for this community. We've got a lot of big-hearted individuals that are making some impact in the world, and that includes our first guest. Jack, do we have our first guest on? Carla, are you with us?
I think so.
Yes, I am.
Oh, Carla, welcome. And just, if you wouldn't mind, just introducing yourself to the listening audience and the name and nature of your nonprofit group.
Sure. Hi, I'm Carla Schroer. I'm a founder and director at Culturalheritageimaging. And we're a nonprofit that's based in San Francisco that focuses on historic preservation, digital preservation of collections, historic sites, archaeological sites, and a lot of our work is really about how we can help local and indigenous communities as well as professionals in the industry to apply scientific approaches to imaging and documenting artworks and sites.
Well, that sounds like a major undertaking, which I'm sure we're going to kind of unpack and kind of peel back the layers of everything you're doing, because you've got quite a bit that you offer within your organization. But how the heck do you get something like that started? What was the birth of an idea that launched this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we founded actually in 2002. So we've been around for 21 years and change. And my husband and I actually started it. I was working in Silicon Valley and had always kind of been looking for something that was more about taking the skills that I have and giving back as opposed to working, in a corporate environment. And my husband and I both share a love of art and history. And he was doing some, coming at it from the sculptural side, some early laser scanning actually in the very, very early 90s and other types of 3D scanning. And anyway, we thought about what are our skills and what could we do, and that's kind of how it came together.
Wow. Well, I in the back of my head, I'm thinking, okay, a lot of indigenous populations have verbal history, and as I understand it, there's not a lot of written history that goes back generations, and it's mainly just carrying from one to the next stories, if you will, and being a public radio listener, there's programs like Storyboard and others out there, and you're doing it, but with the indigenous community in a way that it's digital records now, rather than just being a verbal lore that's been continued on.
Yeah, I would say, a difference there, and the work that you're talking about is incredibly important and valuable. That's focused on oral tradition and on, sound and video. We're more focused on collecting good information about static objects and sites using digital cameras to do that. And so a big part of our work is how can we teach other people to take off-the-shelf digital cameras, take sequences of images that will give them high-quality, measurable 3D data, for example, and there's some surface-type captures that we can do to look at fine surface details. And part of our work is really to figure out how we can also help people understand that at the time they're collecting those images, that data, they need to be thinking about the preservation of that work and how that work can be shared with others and preserved for the future. And so that's really true for the kinds of oral stories that you're talking about, but it's also really critical for these sort of complex digital representations that we all kind of see all over the place. But most of those are being created for entertainment, for games, for, videos and movies. And so they don't have that requirement of them being tied to something in the real world and being measurable and being a record and documentation of that. So that's really the space where we fit in, is that how do we collect information about stuff that exists in the real world and preserve that digital information. And the key thing is we don't want to do it all. We want to teach other people to do it.
Is that how it originally began too, or was it your idea to go and record and then you realized, wow, we are going to need help? Or was it right from the inception that you said, we've got to teach these communities how to preserve their own history?
Well, I would say in the beginning, that's a really great question. In the beginning, we started out with more of a focus on archaeology, but we always had the idea of kind of being I hate to use the word in between, a medium in between. Sort of, there was technology that was coming out. And remember, this was 2002 when we started, so digital cameras were still not as widely used, and certainly computers were not as powerful. At least, the computers people could afford to have were not as powerful, and so that idea of, really in the beginning, we went out and started talking to people, to archaeologists. We went on a couple of digs as volunteers, and to say, what do you wish you had? What do you need? And then talk to our computer graphics and computer science professors and other people that we knew. What's possible? What can we do with this technology, that technology? So we kind of became this place in between to say, how do we take what's available and make it accessible so that people can do it for themselves? And in that work, we also ended up getting some grant funding to collaborate with other groups to develop some open source software for some of the pieces of the pipeline that were not in place. So we used some commercial software, but where there weren't the right things, we raised money and found collaborators and built out some open source tools as well.
So take us on a little bit of a timeline journey, if you don't mind, about your first cultural communities that you began working with and how it has branched out into 21 plus years, 22 years later. Where were you then and where are you now?
Oh my God, night and day. So, in 2002, like say, digital cameras were still a pretty new thing. Most museums were doing their imaging on film at that time, or just starting to switch over. But there were these new techniques in the field of what we call computational photography that we knew couldn't be done with film cameras. They required digital imaging, and they could allow us to see like really fine details of surfaces or to collect important 3D information. So like say initially we started kind of in the archaeological community, and we went to a couple of conferences and started to understand, like, what are you doing now to document things? What could we do to add to that? Met some folks. Really, the next community we worked with, I would say, would be fine art conservators, so museum conservators. And we were able to get some grant funding from the Institute for Museum and Library Services to provide training classes to the graduate programs for art conservation in North America. And so that really got us a foot in the door with a lot of the museum community. It was always in the back of our mind that we wanted to work more with indigenous communities, local communities, underserved communities. But initially, we had to work it out. What were we doing? How could we train people? What were the things that were getting in the way of them in adopting these technologies?
And what was that? What was getting in the way?
Well, I think part of it was just an awareness of what you had, what to do, because for the two primary technologies that we work with, so one is called photogrammetry, and that's how we take a sequence of images, overlapping images, and we can use computer software to turn that into 3D models. Mm-hmm. And then the second technique, which we were actually doing earlier than we were doing photogrammetry, is called reflectance transformation imaging, which is a mouthful, or RTI. And that's a technique where we use light in different positions around a fixed camera, and we can produce in software really, really fine details of the surface, and we can relight that camera view from any direction, and we can mathematically enhance it. So all of a sudden we can, like, we've worked with petroglyphs and inscriptions that are worn or hard to see, and we can bring back information that's just barely there in a way that we can visualize it and see it with that technique. So first, there were not very many people that were aware of that technique, and then two, like, how were they going to do it? And initially, there was some software. It was developed at Hewlett-Packard Labs, and it was not easy to use. It was what I call propeller head software. So we were able to get some easier to use software in place. We wrote user guides. We figured out some methodology to make it easier for people to actually do it. And then we started offering the training to help them sort of get over what's necessary to get good results using that technique. And then the photogrammetry for the 3D, we started doing training in that we've been doing it for a long time, but we started doing training in it, I would say, in 2013, 2014, something like that. So really the big impediments were people either not being aware of the technologies or not knowing how to apply them, both in terms of getting the photography sequences they needed and in how to process and deal with the results.
Wow. So you gave me a whole bunch of information right there. One thing I'm thinking about is that the reflectance transformation imaging, RTI, this technique, does it go so far as what comes to mind is like Archimedes palimpsests, where Archimedes had work and then did work on top of that, and there's a way of drawing out the previous work. Or are we just talking like petroglyphs that have worn down through years of erosion and there's very little to discern, and the way in which you're reflecting light from different positions is drawing it out? I mean, to what degree can you use this technology?
Yeah, so the example that you gave, the Archimedes palimpsests, they're using a different imaging technique, which we also do a little bit of, but it isn't like our primary area, which is called spectral imaging. So they're using actually different spectra outside the visible or narrow bands within visible light in order to try to different mediums reflect at different wavelengths of light. And so there are groups that have whole systems, and Library of Congress does a lot of this work, RIT does a lot of this work, where they can pull out that type of information. And we actually have done some spectral imaging in combination with RTI and in combination with photogrammetry, so you can kind of mix and match these things. But the RTI, we're using visible light, and what we can detect are very, very subtle changes in the surface shape. And we can separate the color and the shape, and we can look at a surface with the color off. And often our human brains, our human perception, we follow the color. So we don't see little subtle surface changes because the color gets in our way. And so by being able to separate the color and just look at the surface shape, we can see these really fine cracks or bubbles or corrosion. So it allows, like, art conservators, for example, to sometimes find evidence of earlier conservation treatment on a subject. We've been able to pull out very hard-to-read signatures. We've worked with a lot of petroglyphs and Native American rock art, and actually rock art in other parts of the world, where we have been able to see things that are really worn and pull back, primarily for petroglyphs. So when we talk about rock art, there's sort of two kinds. The pictographs are painted, and petroglyphs are engraved or pecked, carved.
I never knew the difference. Thank you.
Yeah, and sometimes people in the same site will use both techniques. But so the RTI is most useful for the carved or pecked, the petroglyph style. And when those areas are worn, we can often bring back and figure out the original design. We can also use it to help when lines are crossing each other to figure out which one came first and which one is on top. It's used for looking at, coins. It's used for looking at fine condition details. So, was there a crack? Is that crack getting bigger? If it's, obviously if it's a big crack, you can figure it out. But for something that's very subtle, we can see brush strokes on paintings, things like that.
Wow. If you're just tuning in right now, you're listening to KSQD Santa Cruz, KSQT Prunedale. Maybe you're online at KSQD or KSQD.org. I'm talking to Carla Schroer, and she's the founder and director of Cultural Heritage Imaging, a nonprofit group out of San Francisco who helps indigenous populations, different communities. It teaches them about digital imaging and recording the artwork that is distinct for their culture. So my question, Carla, would be, okay, you've taught these different groups, communities, how to capture these digital images of these pieces of art history. Where does this go? Do you have a connection to the Library of Congress, the Smithsonian? Do you set them up with their own website? Are there, you've mentioned galleries, so are museums seeking this out? What goes on?
Yeah, that's a great question, and the answer is it really, really varies. So a lot of institutions have their own digital repositories and ways that they manage their digital data. And when you see things on a website, that's sort of, we kind of separate the preservation of the data, the longevity of that data, and how it's going to be managed over time and archived over time from the dissemination of that data. So when you're looking at things on a website, you're looking at sort of the dissemination of the data. It may have been very much downsampled from the full high-res, versions. But so in terms of that long-term preservation and the reuse of the data, again, it's going to vary depending on who we're working with and the different institutions. We have worked with the Library of Congress. We've worked with Smithsonian, multiple museums, and they have a digital program office and 3D imaging team that we worked with and trained some of their staff. So the different groups kind of have their own ways of, and plans for how they're going to maintain that data. But one of the things that we felt like was really missing, and lots of people were telling us was missing, is if people take a photograph, there's kind of a pretty well understood set of information about the photograph that you would want to keep, what the settings on the camera was, what kind of camera you use, that kind of stuff. But for these much more complex digital representations that are made from lots of photos. So for an RTI, we're talking, 40 to 60 photographs. For photogrammetry, it's really going to depend. It could be anywhere from, 50 to 2,000 images. And we're processing those into digital representations. So there weren't really good practices, I would say. We're not even at the point of standards, but good practices for what information should we be keeping about how we collected that data and how we're going to preserve that data. So we developed with funding from various sources over many years, and most recently the National Endowment for the Humanities, in collaboration with a team in Heraklion, Crete, that's part of the Greek National Research Council, open source software called the Digital Lab Notebook. And it really helps people to collect good information, good metadata about their imaging projects, and it helps them wrap all of that up with their images into a format in a couple different standardized formats that allow them to then deposit it with a variety of different kinds of repositories like university libraries or other kinds of institutions that can accept that kind of data. So that's a pretty new project. That software's been out for about a year and a half now, and really trying to push people towards thinking not just about, hey, I'm collecting this data right now for my project, but how is that data going to live beyond me and be useful to somebody else, both now and in the future. And I want to make another point about that because it's really related to this current work we're doing with indigenous communities and local and underserved communities, which is that they really need to have good tools to help them keep track of what they're doing and to help other people understand what they've done, what we've done, because today what we see happening is that there's so much, it's difficult for people to understand how to assess the quality of, for example, a 3D model. And so often how that happens in our field is people say, oh, that was made by, you mentioned Smithsonian and Library of Congress. So people know certain groups by name, and they think if they made it, I can trust it. And if it's somebody I've never heard of, I probably can't trust it. So you can see that really harms the little groups, the small groups, because they could be doing really high quality work, and who's going to know? And so this tool, the Digital Lab Notebook, really the core idea behind us putting so much effort into it was this idea of democratizing technology and allowing people to understand the data and the digital representation and let the data speak for itself, so that the work of somebody in the Passamaquoddy tribe that we're working with in Maine, their work to document petroglyphs in Maine can stand toe-to-toe with the work of any world-class institution because they followed good practice, and somebody can look and see that they followed good practice and that they have high-quality data. So their work has meaning to other people because they're keeping track of what they did and they're doing good work.
And is that actually manifesting where the playing field is level, so to speak, amongst the giant, notable establishments and these localized groups?
Not yet, but I mean that's the vision, right? We're a nonprofit. We have to have big ideas. We have to be forward-looking, right?
Heck yeah!
So that's the problem we're trying to solve. That's the big vision, but it's early days.
Oh, that's wonderful work, though. So I just kind of like more into along the human interest line here in speaking person to person, Carla. What have been the most exciting groups or the most surprising? Like you get into it and your heart just bursts because this is exactly how you were envisioning this.
Well, I would say recently, so we have this current grant where we're working with 3 indigenous communities, and that's funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities. And one of the groups we're working with is the Alaska Native Heritage Center in Anchorage. And so we were there in November, and this is a program that includes purchasing some photo gear and a computer for each of the sites, as well as 2 in-person training sessions. One is on photography skills and the RTI, and then the second one a few months later is for the photogrammetry, because you really have to get one set of skills before you can do, the second one. So when we went up to work with the Alaska Native Heritage Center, well, one, they're hosting this, so other Alaska natives could come in that were not in part of the Alaska Native Heritage Center to be part of this program and take these training classes. But when we got to the Alaska Native Heritage Center, they have a significant collection that just came to them during the pandemic from Wells Fargo. So Wells Fargo had purchased a bank in Alaska where the original owners had collected a lot of Alaska Native material, and Wells Fargo decided they didn't want to be in that museum business anymore, and they have gifted this material to multiple groups in Alaska. And Alaska Native Heritage Center got some of that, but the pieces that they received, which I think is somewhere around 1,700 pieces, they really are focusing on how to repatriate those objects back to the original Native groups that they came from.
You said 1,700?
That's what went to the Alaska Native Heritage Center from this Wells Fargo collection.
Oh, my gosh.
So the total collection, I don't remember now, the total collection was thousands of pieces, and some went to the Alaska Heritage Institute, some went to the Anchorage Museum. There are other groups that got parts of this collection in Alaska. But Alaska Native Heritage Center, their goal and their focus has really been on how do we research these pieces and give them back. And so these imaging tools are helping them with that research, and also so that they have good documentation that they can maintain even after the pieces have gone back to the groups. Where they originally came. Most of this material was collected, my understanding is, in the 60s and 70s. So that was just like, oh my God, what a great use of this kind of technology. It was really fantastic.
Yeah, and what a great way to fortify and reinforce trust amongst unknown groups with one another. Wow, that's unbelievable. And so when you approach a group, a community that has their own heritage, do you have open arms? Do they welcome you in? Does it take a little bit of, no, just how would I say, just a little bit of a relationship building kind of time? Like, how does that work for you?
Yeah, well, the first thing is we don't approach people. People approach us.
Oh, really?
So, yeah, by and large, I'm not saying we never approach people, but by and large, people come to us and say, I have this site, I have this problem, I have this issue, and, what can we do? And sometimes they have funding or they're going to be writing a grant. Sometimes, like for this project, we were the primary author of this grant for the 3 indigenous communities, but all 3 of these communities had approached us about training or getting involved in projects that were important to them. The Passamaquoddy tribe we were actually introduced to through the National Park Service because they have this really important petroglyph site that is underwater twice a day. It's at risk. And they wanted to get it documented. And initially we were approached about coming out to do documentation, and we said, well, we can do that, but we're really more interested in training. Is that something you'd be interested in? Are there people in your community that would be interested in this kind of training? And Donald Saktoma, the tribal preservation officer, said, oh, absolutely. So that was, part of the impetus to put this grant together, was that we had been approached by these different communities that didn't really have the funding to do what they envisioned and wanted to do. How could we put a program together to make that possible? And we've had other groups, like we worked with the Alaska Heritage Institute, and they had funding directly. So they came to us and said, we want training, and, we went and did training in Juneau for them.
Wow. All right, Carla, we're unfortunately kind of coming up at the end of our segment here, but I want to give you an opportunity because we've got an amazing supported listening audience, and they support KSQD, and we can be here because of them, and they've got tremendous hearts, and I'm sure many of them care about holding on to history, especially in these indigenous cultures. So how can people support your nonprofit?
So we have a website, Culturalheritageimaging.org, all one word, and we have a donate page, of course, but we also sometimes are looking for in-kind things and volunteers for certain kinds of projects. But it would support has been amazing and really, really helped us through the pandemic when we had a lot of projects planned in 2020 that all required travel, and obviously we couldn't do them. And our donors are huge and really allow us to work with some of these, particularly these underserved communities that have very little funding, and they allow us to work with those communities for significantly less money than that we can charge them than what it costs us to deliver those things. And we also have some free resources on our website. If you just want to learn more, we have open source software you can download. There's instructional videos and user guides on some of these technologies. And that's part of what our donor base helps to make happen.
Well, I just thank you so much for all the work you're doing. And thank you for coming on and sharing it with our KSQD listeners. And I just want to thank you for being here and doing what you're doing.
Well, thank you for having me, Rocky. Really, really enjoyed it.
Well, for right now, we're going to take a break. We're near the bottom of the hour. You're listening to KSQD Santa Cruz, KSQT Prunedale on 89.5, 89.7, 90.7 FM, and online at ksqd.org.